Politicians and journalists in Canada have an interesting relationship. Politicians have a message to get out and a perspective they want Canadians to see presented in a fair way. The job of a journalist is to report the news and to write stories that dig deeper than the talking points the politicians would prefer they recite. This can sometimes be a tense relationship if either the politician or the journalist feels they aren't being treated fairly. Most democratic countries around the world have a public broadcaster that really should be neutral and balanced. In Canada, our public broadcaster is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC. In this video, I'll talk about the CBC, where it sits on the political bias spectrum, and why some politicians are always talking loudly about defunding the CBC. We all have our preferred places to get news, and many are drawn to sources that reflect their own personal view. We like hearing from people who agree with us. It's natural, because it validates our own beliefs. But how do you tell if a news source is presenting the story in a fair way? Is CBC biased, as some people think? There's lots of guides to media bias out there, but one I'd like to highlight is Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital Media Literacy. They have lots of great resources on their website, and their goal is to help each of us know what to look for when we look at things in the media, and be able to decide what might be skewing the truth. They highlight that there can be subtle bias in photo choice, selection or omission of facts, placement of the story, words in the headline and the body of the story, which can all impact the tone of the piece. A quicker way to approach it is to look at a media bias chart. The good ones use transparent methods to assess different news outlets for bias. These bias charts are easy to find for the US, but it gets tougher for Canada. There's this chart that shows political party endorsement by Canadian newspapers since 1980, and it shows a lot of conservative leaning in the newspaper industry. But does that mean that all the reporting in all these papers is biased towards the Conservative Party? I couldn't really find an exclusively Canadian media bias chart, but Ad Fonts Media in the US includes some Canadian content in its interactive media bias chart, and it's pretty good in my opinion. So now the big question, where's CBC? Well, it's right here, sometimes skewing to the left, but for a lot of other news articles that were examined, CBC was hugging the center, right where we want them to be. Poilievre and conservatives in general, I think, don't like the CBC because it doesn't give them glowing praise that the Toronto Sun or the National Post opinion pieces do. And conversely, for Liberal, they don't like Sun Media because the Sun really seems to be a biased, Trudeau-hating outlet that simply parrots the talking points of conservative politicians. But why make a commitment that one of the first things you'll do if you become Prime Minister is to defund the CBC? This is a promise that many conservative leaders have made before and never followed through on. Will it be different this time? Maybe why defunding the CBC has been talked about a lot but never enacted is because it's not what a majority of Canadians want. A poll by Angus Reid in July 2023 found that only 36% of respondents want the CBC defunded. 47% don't want this to happen. Another poll by Spark in April 2023 found that 55% want CBC maintained and 45% want it shut down. In that poll, 67% of Conservatives are all for taking a hatchet to the CBC and think CBC journalism is propaganda for the federal government. Seems a bit extreme to me. So what's the Conservative beef with the CBC? Well, money is one thing. The CBC received a little less than 70% of its funding from taxpayers, around $1.3 billion last year. And we just learned on February 29th, that amount will increase this year to around $1.4 billion. That's a lot. So I get it. When we're spending that much money, there should be some reasonable scrutiny. But I don't think that's entirely it. Defenders of the CBC say it provides service to smaller communities where private companies are much less interested in providing local news and stories because the market is so small and they can't make any money doing it. I think that's probably true, but it's an argument that seems lost on the CBC haters. They see the cost and the fact that the CBC doesn't give their preferred politicians glowing praise like many other media outlets do. To them, that's reason enough to want to trash it completely. And I see that point of view. It makes sense. If you as a taxpayer are paying for a broadcaster that seems to be favoring politicians that are the opposite to what you want, that could be frustrating for you. I think that even if the CBC didn't skew left, and was instead firmly entrenched in the political center, the haters would still feel it's an arm of the Liberal government because CBC would continue to show Conservative politicians as they truly are. And the haters likely feel that asking reasonable questions about the logic or feasibility of proposals being put forward by these politicians means you have a horrible Liberal bias. In reality, we need to be open to talking about reasonable ideas from all sides. That means asking questions that are uncomfortable to all politicians and expecting they'll be straightforward in responding, rather than attacking the journalist for asking the question. Reminds me of someone. But there's another aspect to the CBC that is lost on the haters, and it was discussed in a great article in the National Post in March 2023. I know, the National Post. I've always thought the National Post skewed considerably to the political right, but here they are on the media bias chart, right in the center. Who would have thought? The article talks about a huge element of the CBC that Conservatives miss. Rather than seeing it as just another government program that should be cut to save money, the haters miss that the CBC is a cultural institution that helps shape Canadian identity. The article talks about the need for Conservatives to see the CBC as a cultural influencer for Canadians and to engage with the CBC to help shape the stories that are told. Not just things like art, music, film, and other things that promote a happy and healthy and equitable Canada for everyone, but also things that reflect Conservative values. In a particularly poignant paragraph, the article states, Conservatives must recognize that promoting Conservative values does not simply mean rejecting anything new or different. Instead, they need to embrace the diversity of Canadian culture and work to shape it in a way that reflects their values. And the very next paragraph is equally awesome. The key to building a strong Conservative culture is to reject the toxic and unproductive us versus them paradigm. We must recognize that there are real differences between us, but we also must understand that these differences can be a source of strength. We must learn to appreciate the diversity of perspectives and ideas within our country and work to build a community that values these differences. In doing so, we can build a tolerant culture that is strong and conservative. Fantastic. Except that last part, maybe. I'm less interested in building a culture that's conservative, but the rest is gold. Shouting about defunding the CBC mainly because you don't like being challenged on some of your wackier ideas isn't going to help the Conservative cause. Being reasonable and engaged in helpful conversations will. I think more voters that are disillusioned with whomever the current government is will be more willing to vote for another party if that other party is seen as trying to do good things, not burn everything to the ground and blame the Prime Minister for lighting the match. Stephen Harper was an uber-controlling leader. He wanted ultimate control over the message. And I suspect Pierre Poilievre will be the same. There are several examples of him attacking journalists from the Canadian press and the CBC, refusing to answer their questions. Is this what Canadians want? Surely even Conservatives see the value in having a leader who isn't afraid of taking genuinely important questions. If your idea is a really solid one that is going to truly make the lives of all Canadians better, answering a few questions honestly will allow you to go beyond just reciting slogans, and will lead to convincing more Canadians to give your ideas a chance. If you're afraid to do that, and instead attack the journalist because you don't like what they write, Canadians will see that for what it is. You're not being honest in your message. I think a better way forward is for all politicians to be open to conversations with the media. Politicians will always have their favorites. They leak stories too. That's the way things work. And most of the time, the favorites will be journalists that write stories that tend to be supportive of their position. But we as consumers of media aren't stupid. We have natural bull detectors that are pretty good, and we can easily tell which stories are hyper-partisan. Politicians need to be open to journalists asking questions, even questions they're uncomfortable with. Journalists are part of the accountability mechanism of government, and if a politician feels they're being treated unfairly, they can try to correct the journalistic bias by providing verifiable clarifications. But simply attacking journalists, belittling them, or even threatening them is a sign the politician isn't interested in healthy debate of an alternate view of any situation. That approach will lead to a hyper-partisan government that won't be able to work with other parties on the problems that matter most to Canadians.